Principle number 4, straight ahead versus pose to pose. This principle is mostly about workflow. And in this lesson, I'll explain the difference between straight ahead and pose to pose, and then we'll be animating a box hitting the ground in Maya. Straight ahead animation is when you start at frame 1, make a pose, and then move to frame 2, and make a pose, and 3, and so on, until you finish the whole animation. This is the way stop motion animators have to animate, but it can also be really useful to all other animation mediums as well. Pose to pose animation is when you pose out only your major storytelling poses or keyframes first, and then do the frame by frame in-betweens after. This is like storyboarding your animation. So these are the pros and cons of straight ahead versus pose to pose animation. So the benefits of using straight ahead is that it tends to be much more fun, so you might end up animating something more interesting than initially planned. So the bad thing about straight ahead animation is that if you want to iterate on your animation and see it done a better way, you will have already wasted a lot of time animating the whole thing out. For pose to pose, the benefit is that you can plan and make iterations of your animation before spending too much time actually animating frame by frame. The bad thing about pose to pose is that it can cause your animation to look stiff and sometimes less alive if you're only sticking to your original plan. So which one should you use? Both. When I started animating as a kid in flipbooks and with clay animation, I used to do straight ahead. And then when I got into high school and started animating with a light table, I only animated pose to pose. But now that I've been animating for a while, I like to use both methods freely. I found that if you use both methods in your shot, then you can reap the benefits of pose to pose by planning out your idea well beforehand, and then when it's time to animate, you can benefit from straight ahead by not being afraid to change your plan if you come up with something better in the moment. There's so much good about doing both, so that's why I don't think a good animator would stick to only one way. Let me show you how I used both with this shot I animated. With an acting shot like this, I will typically shoot reference or draw thumbnails or both and time out my animation only focusing on the key poses. I time them out and then watch them. Once I think it's good, I usually show it to my friends and ask them if they think it's funny. They usually have some notes, so then I redraw or retime my key poses until we agree that it's working. So this is all just done on my iPad all before I open Maya or any other software. I like to spend a full day or two just thinking and drawing thumbnails. Planning my animation out like this is an example of how I like using pose to pose method. Then I pose out those drawings on my character rig in the scene. Once my thumbnails match my rig, I hide my original thumbnails and start breaking down and in-betweening the animation. This is where straight ahead animation can come in handy. When I was in-betweening this section of the shot, I wanted her head to tilt screen left as she goes up. I just felt it looked nice in the pose and it made it seem like she was feeling all tingly. Then I realized I could push her shoulder up too. That's when I thought it would be great to have her alternate her shoulder so that she does a little shimmy as she settles down and feels her whole body tingle. I was definitely not originally planning on animating her that way. She was just going to settle straight down, from one key to the next. But I made use of those pose adjustments in the moment, and I wasn't afraid to just animate her straight ahead and feel out the character frame by frame. I was really happy I did this because I think it added a lot more life to her. The other way I use straight ahead animation in this is when I went to animate her little ponytail. I started at frame 1 and then edited it each frame until the end. Most things like hair or rope or something that changes a lot from frame to frame, I just do straight ahead. I also notice I tend to animate straight ahead on props too. So if something like a basket or a box falls and bounces on the ground a little bit before it settles, it's just easy to animate those straight ahead because they almost vibrate or jump into place. Now that I've shown you the concept of these workflows, let's open up Maya and see if we can make use of them. Alright, now that you have Maya open, we're going to be animating a box falling and hitting the ground. So we don't need a rig for that. Let's just make a box. Let's make a ground. Let's scale that ground up. The box is a fine size the way it is, but let's adjust it a little bit. Let's color it. So right click, hold, go to assign favorite material, go to Lambert. In your attribute editor, go to Lambert and click on the color, and let's make it some nice blue, light blue color maybe. There we go. Alright, let's also take the edges and make them rounder. So you can right click, hold and drag onto edge, select all the edges, shift right click and hold on an edge and let go on bevel edge, and then on fraction make that only a little bit, maybe 0.1, and then add some segments to it. Maybe make the fraction a little bigger. No, 0.1 is fine. Cool. Now we have our box. Let's add some controllers. Go to curves. Click on the circle NURBS curve. Let's delete the history and freeze the transforms on both of these things. Click on your NURBS curve, click on your geo, edit, delete by type history, modify, freeze transforms. You got to do that a lot of the time when you create anything in Maya. It just cleans up the scene. Okay, let's take the cube and middle mouse drag and drop it into the NURBS circle. Let's name our NURBS circle, double click on it and name it anim cube main. Cool. Okay, now we have our rig. Let's turn off our grid and let's put this plane into a layer. You can click on this thing down here in the display tab where it says layers and just click on the icon all the way to the right. And what that does is anything selected, it'll put it into a layer. And that way you can hide the layer, or you can change it to R means reference and you won't be able to select it. Or you can change these options to make only NURBS curves selectable. Okay, I'm going to turn my ambient occlusion on just so I can see where the cube is on the ground. And let's try to animate this thing fall. So I want the animation to be about 40 frames. Let's bring our cube up to about here is fine. Let's hit S and maybe have a little bit of rotation on it so it's a little bit more natural as it's falling. And then we want it to hit the ground on frame 15. So let's zero these out and bring him so he's on the ground. And then what we want is to have a little bit of bouncing around after he lands and then completely settling on frame 28. So we have a key on 1, 15, and 28. So here's our animation so far. It just looks like it's slowly touching the ground. Let's make it so it actually falls. So on Translate Y, go into your graph editor, break the tangent, and make that tangent linear. Bring it up a little bit, and maybe bring this guy out a little bit too. Let's watch it. So at least now when it hits the ground, it has a little bit more impact. But what about this section in between here? Between 15 and 28, it seems like it should rattle around a little bit. It can jump and then settle. We're pretending this box is medium weight, maybe about 5-10 pounds or so. It's almost like if we had an effects sim and we just simulated a hard body object. We're going to try to hand animate that. A lot of animators animate things in Maya on stepped mode. You might hear that a lot. So what that is, with all your keys selected, you can turn it to stepped tangent. And then when we watch it, it goes from one frame to the very next keyframe, and there's no interpolation, there's no in-betweens. This is pretty much what pose-to-pose animation is in Maya. It can be really effective to animate like this if you have a lot of time and you want your animation to look really high quality. You can go into every single frame and plan it out exactly how you want. And you can flip through the keyframes with the greater than and less than symbols. I personally found that it's faster to animate when everything's already on splined. So to get back to splined, just click on all your keys in the graph editor and hit auto tangent. We messed up our tangent for the Y, but we can easily fix that now. The reason I like working in spline more is because I can visualize the timing of things immediately. And I can work with the in-betweens right when I'm setting my initial keys. I think I would like doing stepped animation more in Maya if it wasn't on 24 frames per second. If it was on a lower frame rate like 12 FPS where you're animating everything on 2s, stepped animation seems like the way to go. But working with this many extra frames in between your keyframes, the in-betweens need to be polished up in the graph editor a lot. So getting handy with spline tangents and the graph editor is going to make you a pretty fast animator in Maya. That's just my approach. Let me save this animation. Okay, so now let's work in a straight ahead method and get these bounces in here. So actually I think the box would still be rotated when it hits the ground. So let's go into rotate X, Y, and Z and delete these keys. And we can actually make use of the step tangent in here by clicking on everything, hitting step tangent. That way we can access the pose that it's at when it's rotated on the first frame. And you can right click, insert key right here. And then you can put those back to auto tangent for now. Okay. It's going through the ground a little bit. Let's bring this up. And then maybe right here, it bounces up a little bit. And on here, it comes back down, but it's rotated the other way. So that way it bounces. And then I want it to have a little bit of a jump after that. Something tiny. And have it land on the other side, a little bit more rotated. And then the last one, it doesn't really need to jump again, but we can have a little bit of rotation before it's completely settled. So this would be really hard to plan out just as pose-to-pose animation without seeing the in-betweens. Because now we need to go in here and figure out how to make this look like a realistic bounce. So let's go into the Y translate and start adding these little bounces. When it lands, the tangent's broken and linear. Oh, we forgot a keyframe on 25. Let's just hit S. This one can be a little bit higher. Break that, hit linear. That can be a little bit higher. Let's make these linear too. And then the end is when it's completely settled. Doesn't have to actually go through the ground. Whoops. Okay, let's see if those bounces are working any better. So that's working a little better. The rotation seems a little floaty though. So let's go into these rotations in the graph editor. When it hits, it doesn't take much time for it to rotate because it's just ricocheting off the ground. So let's make these, we can make all the rotations linear. So each time it hits the ground, it bounces immediately into the trajectory of the other rotation. This one looks like it's going through the ground a little bit. Let's watch it again. Cool. That's looking better. I noticed something at the end here. It kind of vibrates in place. We kind of want it to bounce a little bit to the left and then to the right. So let's go into our X translate. And we're going to just move this. Oh, I'm sorry. I did this on a weird axis. Usually this is X. So it's actually Z translate. And what we want to do is move it a little bit to the right, I think, when it bounces. Yeah. And we can make that linear too. That feels a little better. I wonder if we can add a little bit of a jump right here. Just a tiny one. Break that, make that linear. And smooth this curve out. Doesn't really matter how smooth this last curve is because it's one keyframe to the next. Alright, let's play it again. It feels like the rotation needs to be a lot more intense on the first bounce. So let's go in and adjust that. We can pose it out in the viewport or use the graph editor. Okay, and then we just have to make sure that the edges aren't going through the ground. Make these curves nice again. And then what is happening here? Oh, there's a tiny little bounce here. Okay, let's see how that looks. Maybe the bounce needs to be higher on the first bounce. Yeah, that helps a lot. We can also play with the Z translate some more. So it goes side to side a little bit more on each bounce. So maybe when it lands over here, it goes a little bit farther. And then on this keyframe, it can be over here. There we go. And then I think one last thing is just checking the rotation and seeing how it starts off. So before it starts to bounce around and the rotation is just linear, we can make the rotation, maybe it rotates into this first bounce. So we can just adjust these a little bit. And then you can make these linear too. And then that way it's kind of rotating as it's falling already. Okay, cool. That kind of looks like a Houdini sim. So in this box animation that we did, we started off thinking about the major key poses, where it's in the air, and when it falls, and how long that takes. And then we used straight ahead to kind of map out where it's going to bounce around before it finally settles. This type of animation is something I've done a lot in professional animation, especially in VFX. You would think that a lot of the time the effects department would handle certain animations like this, but if a director has specific notes on where things need to fall or a prop needs to go, then it's usually taken care of by an actual character animator. So this animation is not completely perfect. If you want to keep tweaking it and making it feel more realistic, be my guest. But this is a good starting point to understand how a hard body object falls on the ground. So now you guys had a chance to look at my workflow, how I approach an acting shot, and how I use pose to pose and straight ahead. You also got to see in Maya how my workflow might differ from other people's who use step tangents. Alright, I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson.